meeting underway so we can get going. And very important thing, I'm told that we really got to be out here at 8:30, so I thought we should get going as quickly as we can. Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. My name is Lem Schrolovic. I'm an attorney at a firm in New York called Weitz and Luxemberg. I've been an environmental lawyer for 20 years. And during that time, I've helped a lot of people, some companies, identify environmental problems and then figure out the best way to address them. And so I'm going to hopefully share some useful experience and knowledge that I've gained over the years for people and communities dealing with the questions and concerns that are so important here tonight. Melanie?
Hi, my name is Melanie Hyman. I'm a science analyst working at Weitz and Luxemberg. My background is in public health and epidemiology. I have a master's from Tufts University in public health and epidemiology.
Good evening, I'm Marilyn Bonilla-Krantz. I am an attorney here in South Florida. I live in Broward County, and I have been practicing law for over 20 years and have been a community advocate on several issues at the state, federal, and certainly the local level.
Thank you, Marilyn. I'm not here to toot our horn and talk about all the wonderful things over the years, but I thought I would just, quickly probably me. What we do and some of the communities we work with. The first thing, and really the reason we're here tonight in this community, is that we work with Erin Brockovich, who you've probably heard of, who, beyond the movie, is a very serious advocate for communities dealing with environmental problems. And at the time, her work with chromium-6 out in Southern California was kind of considered crazy a little bit. But in time, there's really been a consensus built around the country that she was right, and that is an environmental concern that has to be taken seriously. We, as an organization, have worked with communities around the country, addressing and grappling with some of the concerns that you are thinking about in this community. We've worked with communities in Nebraska, in East Tennessee, where I was from originally, and a community up in Plant City, Florida, that is dealing with the effects of groundwater contamination and air pollution. So why are we here tonight in the Acreage? The concern that we have focused on in the information that we have received, the emails, the contacts, the request for help, and the reason we're here to talk about that issue with you tonight is the concern with the number of brain cancers and tumors in the community, especially in children. Now, in any community that is as large as this one, there are going to be, unfortunately, quite a lot of cancers. But generally, cancer in children is much rarer, and brain tumors and cancers in children are also, fortunately, quite rare. So the types of illnesses that we have focused on generally are a kind of tumor known as gliomas. And I'm going to turn to Melanie to talk to you a little bit about what those are and also about how cancer studies or cancer cluster studies, in which there's one ongoing that we expected we might see some results of today, what those kinds of studies are designed to do.
So what is a glioma? As Lem said, there are various types of health outcomes being observed in the community. However, right now I just want to focus on gliomas. It's a type of tumor that starts in the brain or spine. It can go by many names. Glioma is the general classification, but they can arise in different types of cells, and they're named after the exact type of cell that they arise in. So you'll see some listed here. It's not limited to these, but the most common type of glioma is an astrocytoma, and within that class, a glioblastoma multiforme is the most common within that. We have seen in the self-reported data high rates of those. You also might hear them referred to as neuroepithelial tumors of the central nervous system. So from there, I want to talk about cancer cluster studies. So what a cancer cluster is a high incidence of a specific cancer or other outcome over a specific time frame. The Center for Disease Control publishes certain specific guidelines about how cancer cluster studies are carried out. And I just want to give you a basic overview of that. First, a case definition is made. What that really means is a when, a time period of concern, the population at risk, which is the who, and where, making really time and space boundaries that you want to be under study. After that, you verify medically the diagnoses in the population within these boundaries I mentioned. From there, you calculate the number of what's called expected cases based on national or more local cancer statistics. And then the last step is really to compare those expected numbers to what you're seeing observed in your community. So, for example, to make it apply to this situation, let's take the acreage. So one of the things that we're seeing in the community is gliomas in 14-year-old children 14 years old or younger, males and females. So that is the case definition. And then as far as the time and space boundaries I was talking about, whatever is deemed relevant, in this case the acreage or the 3 zip codes. From our preliminary analysis using what's called the SEER database, it stands for Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results Program. It's a database of cancer statistics about prevalence and incidence of different kinds of cancers that's run by the government, the National Cancer Institute. So from our preliminary analysis, the expected number of cases of this specific type of glioma in this specific population, children 14 years old and younger, it is seen that less than 1 case in a population this size would be expected. So now the question you're probably asking is, well, how many are there in this community? And at this point, it's hard to say. It's actually impossible to say because the cancers that have been reported thus far are self-reported, meaning they're not official. There's no reason to think that they're not legitimate, not completely 100% truthful. However, in epidemiologic studies, medical verification is totally necessary because there's a huge difference even between 1 and 2 cases. So medical verification means looking at either medical records of the self-reported cancers and looking at the registry, either on a state level or on a national level. So having said that, the self-reported data suggests that there's more than 1 case of this type of glioma in this community, in this age group. So this brings me to the Florida Department of Health study. Obviously we were expecting results today, but unfortunately they're not available. However, the results really should prove helpful no matter what they come out with. This will fill in the gaps in knowledge we have about the true number of cases in the community. Obviously not able to predict what they will find in the future. Sorry. But yes, we don't have the results of that yet. When we do get those, as I said, that will fill in a lot of gaps in knowledge we are looking for. And, even one case, or whatever they might find, the next question that arises is really, what is causing those cancers? And if they do find a cancer cluster, what's causing that? And that's when we've looked at what kinds of things might cause that. It could be anything from behavior, chance, and then obviously environmental factors can always play a role. And from our preliminary analysis of what we've seen, I do believe that environmental factors are playing a role here. And again, at this point, at the early stages of the investigation, it's hard to say exactly what those exposures are. Only further investigation will lend itself to that. But that is where we stand as of now. And Lem will talk to you about where to go in the future.
So we believe that there is a issue with the brain tumors and cancers in the children in the community, unfortunately. And as Melanie really has just laid out, we think that an environmental factor may be at play contributing to those cancers. So the question really becomes, well, what do we do to reduce future harm and prevent the risk of this happening to anybody else or any other children or adults for that matter? And so I want to speak to that for a few minutes, and Marilyn is going to address that as well. But the first thing that must be done if the environment is at play is to identify what environmental factor is it. And that is fortunately being addressed. The Florida DEP recently collected random samples in the community of private wells, and unfortunately private well water is all too often the subject of contamination by harmful substances. In my experience with contaminated groundwater, it's very often the waste disposal practices that occurred in the 1960s, the 1970s, and sometimes, but less so, in the 1980s, because we as a society in this country learned from really terrible tragedies in communities. Love Canal up in Niagara Falls, New York, and Times Beach in Missouri, where the community had their dusty roads oiled with dioxin and PCB-laden oil, that hazardous chemicals have to be handled and disposed of properly. So there was a sea change in that behavior in this country for the better in 1980 when the federal hazardous waste laws went into effect across the country. And things haven't been perfect since then by any means in the handling of those kinds of chemicals that can cause so much harm, but things were vastly improved. However, with groundwater migration, groundwater and the contaminants that it may carry travels slowly, a few inches a month, a year, a few feet a year, but over the years and over the decades, contaminants can travel quite far. So it's natural and appropriate to look in a community for an environmental exposure first at private wells. So fortunately, that testing has gone forward. Based on my understanding, the results should be available and released sometime in September, and we are looking forward to that because that is going to answer or help answer one of those very important questions about potential environmental factor. But groundwater is not the only factor that could be at play. If you think about what a kid does in the environment or how the environment might affect a kid, you know, they obviously drink, bathe in domestic water. And if that's contaminated, that's a problem. They also play outside and they breathe air. So if the soil in which the child plays and breathes and gets dust on their hands is contaminated, that's a potential exposure pathway that can cause harm to kids and to adults as well. We also take into our bodies roughly 4 liters of water a day from all sources, but we breathe into our bodies several hundred liters of air. So sometimes it's something in the air. So when there is a problem that may be an environmental problem, it is important to think about and look at all the various pathways in which a harmful chemical can enter in the body. And one of the things that I've observed in this community is that it has really come together and mobilized around this issue and has asked for answers. And, you know, to its credit, has said, we're worried about our kids, as everyone is, and we need some answers as to what may be causing this, so if there's anything we can do to prevent or reduce that risk to everyone, and everyone who is fine now, let's certainly find out what it is and take that action. And that's a very important thing to do, because one thing I've learned in the environmental exposure context is much of the difficulty is identifying the problem and understanding what it is. Once it's identified and understood, the science of environmental science and exposure to dangerous substances is advanced to the state where most time the harm, the exposure can be reduced. It's generally feasible to do that. There are treatment technologies, there are ways to cut off or minimize, reduce exposure. So it's not like finding the answer is a dead end. Typically it is the most difficult part, but one that then suggests a remedy to reduce that harm going forward. Marilyn is going to talk for a minute about really the importance of advocacy and kind of the important role that government plays in reducing harm and preventing risk from environmental causes.
Thank you. Well, this community certainly mobilized and is to be commended. Certainly what your experience is will have an impact around the state of Florida and perhaps this whole country. It's very important as you have to work with your legislators both at the state and national level. And tonight we have 2 representatives who have been very active. Again, we're working with the Department of Health. It's essential that your representatives are working very closely with them to certainly monitor the progress and certainly monitor the quality of the services that are being rendered on behalf of this community. So we have with us tonight Representative Joseph Abruzzo, which is right here. Please, if you'll stand up. He's been very active in working with, you know, the state to assure that we have the kind of accountability that we need. We also have Representative Carl Domino, who's here and has again been writing letters on this community's behalf. Senator Dave Ehrenberg could not be here tonight, but his legislative assistant, Abby Ross, is here. And Michelle McGovern is here from Senator Bill Nelson's office, which was extremely important that the senator was able to mobilize our federal resources to assure, really, to assure that we have an inherent checks and balances. Because once the state, Florida Department of Health came up with their study, I understand that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had certain questions about We're not sure exactly what their questions were, but I can assure you that that second eye on looking at the data, looking at the methodology, can only assist this community. So that continued communication, that continued commitment at the state and federal level is extremely important. The other areas, certainly our county commissioners, certainly our municipal leaders, our water district, elected officials, the South Water Management District, the reach regarding the environmental touch and footprint in our community reaches many, many different state and certainly federal agencies. We have the Florida Department of Transportation. They have a piece in this as well. So it's critical that you continue to connect with all those various government officials, elected officials, whose duty is to protect the public health. So the fact that you're all here today, the fact that you are interested in the information is critical to the impact of certainly staying informed and certainly advocating on behalf of your family and your community to assure that we are safe. You know, we all have children, we all have, you know, it's not only children, it's adults. So the question is, what is causing this? So tonight, what we're hoping to do is to look at not only your community advocacy, tapping your government resources, but certainly what the justice system provides in terms of remedies for many of the families here tonight who have suffered with medical injuries, and certainly many who have passed away. So many of you are hoping and praying that this doesn't reach my threshold, and we're hoping through these efforts that we can prevent any continued harm. But first, as was mentioned, we need to determine the cause. And that is a scientific question. That is one that certainly we're going to be looking at a myriad of factors that could contribute, but certainly they are looking and pointing at this moment to some environmental serious concerns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Len, who's going to talk about the experience across the country in other communities who have dealt with these types of dire conditions and how they have gone about remedying the situation. The other piece of this, not only through the legal system, but through lawmaking and rulemaking. You know, one of the important factors, and I know this community's been concerned about, is, you know, where our schools are located, where our parks are placed. You know, our kids play soccer, they play sports, they play softball. You know, all the turfs are on the ground, is the sod that's being used. Is that certainly meeting the level of clearance to assure that it's safe? So there are many aspects here that once we have the information and once we have the facts, we then need to make sure that we're preventing this and making sure that there are standards and regulations, and those who are charged with enforcing them are doing their job. So it's a myriad of factors that this community and many others throughout the state, especially in South Florida, there are many communities that are backed up against the Everglades, that are backed up against Loxahatchee, where there are certainly many opportunities for contaminants. So this experience is one that will have great reach, and I certainly commend you for having the courage and the organization to come together. So thank you.
We did think that it would be useful if we spoke for a few minutes about the civil justice system and how that works generally in environmental related injuries and damages. I will say I am a lawyer in the state of New York. I am not a lawyer in Florida, so I'm going to be talking to you only about general principles of how communities use the legal system, but please do not take anything that I say as being indicative of Florida law. But one of the things that we have done in this country generally is inherited the common law of England. And many of the principles used in the common law courts in the state, across the states, share certain similarities and then share very important differences in each state. So I'm only going to talk about kind of how these kinds of problems that already exist have a remedy or an ability to pursue redress for existing injury. And generally, the tool that is used is known as a toxic tort lawsuit. And toxic tort lawsuits really are based on very old principles of tort law. Tort law generally, you probably heard of negligence. Hopefully you haven't been involved in any kind of lawsuit like that. But unfortunately, when accidents happen, carelessness is the cause of injury and harm. Those kinds of remedies that are provided may be important. Toxic tort lawsuits really, as I mentioned, are kind of based on what we generally know as a negligence suit. And they really can be distilled to three elements, and each and every one of those elements is a necessary and critical part of such a lawsuit. The first is injury or damage. It's very clear generally that serious illness constitutes injury or damage. The second element is that there has to be identified wrongful conduct. I've listed some examples here that we probably have heard of in a number of contexts. Trespass is an old common law cause of action that is basically at bottom an unauthorized entry onto your property without your permission. And the courts have kind of taken that old concept, which arose out of people building buildings on their neighbor's land, or their animals causing damage to their neighbor's property, to the modern chemical age equivalent of the old goats who ate the neighbor's cabbage, and have applied that to chemicals as an agent of the party who sets them in motion and meets the requirements for trespass. Nuisance goes way back, and then of course negligence does as well. And often the conduct that sets in motion the release of hazardous substances into the environment involves an abnormally dangerous activity. The kind of classic example of that I can think of here is, I think Lion Country Safari is a little bit down the road, and if the lions get out, not many people in this community keep lions. So, that's the kind of thing that if a lion came out and did damage, the court might say, well, that's kind of an abnormally dangerous activity. So that's kind of the concept. And then a very, very critical element, and often the most difficult one to establish and prove, is the causal link between conduct and the injury, particularly in this context when sometimes the conduct that gave rise to the harm occurred many, many years ago. And one thing that's always important to understand in this context is that a plaintiff who is asserting a claim against someone else saying, you have harmed me and you should provide redress to me, has to prove each of these three elements as more likely than not. So I think you can see that a toxic tort case is a fairly complex undertaking, that in this context involves often many scientific disciplines: hydrogeology, meteorology, physics, chemistry, and then, of course, medical expertise. So in establishing, putting together a credible lawsuit that seeks redress for harm caused by an environmental exposure requires the gathering and evaluating of a considerable body of largely scientific evidence that addresses each of these three elements of injury, wrongful conduct, and the causal link between the two. Now, let me talk a bit about the identifying an environmental factor and a responsible party. In this part of a civil lawsuit is oftentimes quite related or flows from an investigation to determine what is the cause of an environmental exposure or hazard in a community. So as I mentioned before, in talking about how do we prevent future harm, how do we stop this from happening? Well, we have to understand, if this is an environmental factor, what are the specific hazardous substances and what are the exposure pathways? Is it the groundwater? Is it something in the soil? Is it something in the air? And then, depending on the answer to that, who is a responsible party? Whose conduct caused that risk and caused those chemicals to be in the community is then a big question. Now, in my looking into this problem in the community, identifying an environmental factor and identifying a responsible party often are very interrelated. Because if you don't know what the chemical is, the approach that I generally use is think about, well, what kinds of chemicals could cause this problem, and who is it that used or uses those chemicals in an area that's close enough for those chemicals to migrate into the community and cause harm. So they are in some way interrelated. In speaking to people in the community and listening to what people have said and their thoughts, one of the names that certainly has come up is Pratt Whitney. The aerospace facility north and west of this community is often been mentioned as a potential source of an environmental problem. I think there are two things about Pratt Whitney that are important. One is that there has been and is currently a very large occupational health study. In fact, I think it's the largest such study in history. Melanie talked to the lead researchers in that study. It's still underway, but the study was initiated by the advocacy of the families and the survivors of former workers of Pratt & Whitney in facilities kind of at their main operations up in the state of Connecticut. And that study focused in significant part on the same types of brain tumors that are being observed in this community. So while that doesn't demonstrate that these cancers are caused by Pratt & Whitney in any way, it does suggest that that is at least a potential source of an environmental contaminant that could be playing a role in these unfortunate illnesses. The other thing is that there is some evidence that the facility over the decades certainly used many different types of toxic and hazardous substances that were disposed of on-site, and that there is evidence of contamination on-site and some evidence that the contamination may have migrated at least some distance off-site. But that's all that we know at this point, to my knowledge. So what are other potential sources that the community is thinking about, and I think rightly so? Some people have mentioned pesticide use. This area historically was used in a large measure for agriculture, and certainly, like with hazardous waste, in decades gone by and currently, pesticides play a very big role in agriculture. Generally, the toxicity of pesticides has been on a downward decline as newer information and newer types of pesticides are available that do the job the kind of old-fashioned, older generations of chemicals, DDT, dieldrin, and more recently some forms of organophosphates have been much more disfavored, and their use has decreased. But pesticides do have a link in the scientific literature with brain tumors and cancers. There's also been questions raised about the possibility of the fill generally that is used to build homes, get them up out of the floodwaters in times of heavy rain, and is that a potential source of contamination? And I think, again, that's a fair question that needs to be answered. It may play a role, it may not play a role. We just don't know at present. So that said, where do we go from here? Well, what my plan is, and what I would invite the community to be involved in, clearly will be to evaluate the results as soon as they come out of the water well sampling that DEP recently did. As I mentioned, those results hopefully will be out soon. I think those will tell us very, very valuable information about the quality of the domestic drinking water in the private wells in the community. But they may not answer all the questions. It may be that there is a need for further testing. It may be that it's something that's not in the groundwater, and it is important for the community to understand that that is just one potential source of exposure to harmful chemicals. One of the things that we have done is we've filed requests, and anyone can file a request for public records that are held by Florida government agencies under the Florida Public Records Law, or law similar to the federal Freedom of Information Law. And we have filed requests with DEP and the Department of Health for information, at least to give us a better understanding of what is the environmental condition up at the Pratt Whitney property, and is that a potential source? The US EPA likewise makes its records available pursuant to a request under the federal Freedom of Information Law, and we have filed requests for those, and those documents may shed light on what kind of historic practices and what kinds of environmental issues go back in time up on that facility that may be relevant to what's happening in the community now, or they may not. The Last thing that I would just like to talk to you about before we invite questions is that we have prepared a questionnaire. It's a factual questionnaire, and what it does is it asks if anyone in your family, you or a loved one, who lives in this community has a cancer or other illness, and then asks you to say where you lived within the community and when. Some people have moved into the community very recently. Some people have lived here many, many years. Some people have no health problems. Other people have many health problems. And in trying to understand, is there an environmental factor, and what is that environmental factor that may be contributing to these illnesses, it's very, very important to understand at a very detailed level, is there some kind of discernible pattern here? Because the image that I use in these kinds of investigations is it's often like putting a puzzle together. Sometimes you turn the pieces over and they fit together and a clear picture emerges. Sometimes you can't put the pieces together and you really have to conclude, after looking at everything you can possibly think of as reasonably related to this potential based on science and our understanding of toxic chemicals, that there isn't an environmental factor, at least that we can identify based on our state of knowledge. That happens. It does. Our knowledge is not in any way perfect. There are big holes on what it is that drives the risk of cancer and other illnesses. Fortunately, in some cases, in many cases, perhaps most, where there is a significant amount of illness in a population, a common thread, a common factor can be identified and can be addressed. So if any of you would like, it's completely up to you, we're going to make some questionnaires available up here at the front, I think during the question and answer period. If you would like to take one, fill it out. It just simply asks for that history of where you lived and what kind of illnesses are in your family. One important thing on the form, we may not have enough. Hopefully we do. Hopefully there is plenty. If you need or want additional copies, because it's important to have the information for each member of your family if they are ill, you can send an email and we will put the, let me do that now, to Jessica, who's here at the front, and you could just request a form and she will send it off to you. We're going to include some reply envelopes. You can just drop it in the mail. And the purpose of that is really to help us see if a pattern emerges that we then can communicate to the community and say, here's what we see. Maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong, but here's how we see that information in terms of what it may mean as it relates to a potential environmental cause. Yes. If you could just wait till after the questions, if possible, that I think would just help the flow, because in just a minute I'm going to invite anyone who would like to ask any of us a question or a general question, which we will try to respond to as best we can. We have a couple of mics, and if you could maybe just line up in the two aisles, if there are a number of you, and you could pass the mic. If I could request that you limit your question to one. I don't know how many there may be. If we have time, I'd be happy to entertain as many questions as possible. As I said before, we do need to be out of the auditorium by 8:30. So we want to honor that and the school's request. I'm going to clarify or just amplify a couple of points on the questionnaire. One is we have a section that talks about other illnesses, and we have heard of quite a number of people in the community who have cysts or other kinds of things. We don't know at this stage whether those are related to the tumors in terms of what may be causing them, but that kind of information may prove useful. So if you could just write in that kind of information, that would be very helpful. There is another section on the form which really is addressed to the Pratt Whitney facility, but I would invite you to think about it more broadly. And what it asks is, did any of you work there as an employee years ago and have knowledge about chemicals used and what happened to those chemicals, how they were handled, how they were disposed of, particularly going back in time. That is the most relevant period for purposes of the potential for Pratt Whitney to be a factor in this community, because again, it would take quite a long time for contaminants to migrate through the groundwater that distance if that is occurring. The other point is that if any of you have information about chemical disposal or chemical usage in the community, or any other hazardous substance that you think would be helpful in trying to answer this question, is there an environmental factor here at play and what is it? That would be extremely important information. So while we thought we had the most questions about Pratt & Whitney, and that's why it has that question, I certainly invite you to let us know about any other sources of dumping or contamination that you know about in the community, particularly going back in time through the years.
Are these on? No. They are on.
No?
Yeah, they're on. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to put these here and over there. And if you guys could just line up, and we'll go from this one to that one and back. And please be respectful and, you know, nice.
If these tests that are being done all come back negative, are you all going to go as much trouble to clear this the area's name in terms of being contaminated as you are trying to gin up support of this place being contaminated? Because all of our homes are going to be worthless if you continue even after these tests are negative.
Well, I think that's a very fair question. And I think that our purpose here is to find out, is there an environmental factor? And if so, what is it? And do something about it. It may be that there is no environmental factor, and having gone through a process that people, reasonable people, can say, you know, we don't think there was anything to that other than either something not known to science or a random distribution of numbers, and it's not a problem. It's an unfortunate event, but it's not a problem. That is, it's not a problem that is tied to any environmental issue in the community. I think that that information is very important. And that is information that if that's the determination, that's what we say. Because many times it is helpful to know that a search for a reasonable environmental risk has been made and nothing's found. That's excellent news.
Well, the question is are you going to make sure that it's news? Or are you just going to disappear and leave us with the myth? We're the love canal.
No, that is not my plan. The involvement of us in this issue is to see if we can help find an answer. And if the answer is we can't find anything, that is an answer that I will freely communicate to the community, to the press, and anyone else who wants to talk to me about it. Absolutely.
We are going to hold you to that.
Fair enough.
If the soil is one of the polluting factors, the majority of the roads in the acreage are up dirt. So how can we stop the dust from flying around? And is there something that the city might be able to do to control the dust factor?
I think the answer to that would be yes. Where there is contamination in superficial shallow soil on top of the ground, a traditional remedy to address that is to remove that shallow soil and replace it. Another potential that certainly controls dust blowing around from roads is paving them. I'm not advocating paving your roads, obviously, but that is something that reduces dust. So I think the answer is yes, if it is road dust that is a factor here. There are ready means available to reduce that.
The biggest problem is the majority of the roads in the acreage are dirt roads. If they were to pave them, that would be a huge expense.
It would indeed.
Has Pratt Whitney ever cleaned up any contamination outside of their property line? And if so, what type of contaminants were removed?
Very good question.
That's a great question. And let me answer it this way. If you're talking about the facility just to the north and west of the facility, here to my knowledge, there has been no evidence that there was a comprehensive investigation of whether there was off-site migration of contamination. And I am aware of no evidence that there was any type of off-site cleanup. Thank you.
Strange, though, that all these cases of cancer, my husband has pancreatic cancer. Isn't it a little strange that all these different cancers are popping up in one area? And now that if they say there is nothing in these tests,
Put the mic up to
how
your
can
mouth.
it be? How can that be?
Mike.
Hold the mic up to your mouth. We can't hear it.
I thought, you know, I talk loud enough.
Okay, I think that if I can, the question really is if the cancer study doesn't find anything, how could that be given all the cancers that are in this community? Is that
And all those,
clear?
and all those dots
Yes.
on that, how can it be that there is nothing causing cancer out in the acreage?
Yes. Well, clearly something is causing cancer. In a community of this size, there will be, unfortunately, quite a lot of cancer, and there will be quite a lot of different kinds of cancer. the environmental question, and I think the question for the community is it something here that is driving that cancer? And typically, the best way of answering that question is to look at what is the kind of the rarest form of cancer. Because if you can find that there is a factor tied to that, it often is a clue as to what may be causing other kinds of cancers that may not look to be such a pattern. That's why when we look at these kinds of questions, we tend to look at the rarer kinds of cancers first and focus on those and see if an environmental factor can be identified for those. That's not to say there's not some environmental factor that contributes to cancer. I think, there are, unfortunately, but those are
If we had reverse osmosis all this time, though, would that wipe out drinking that type of water, or would that wipe it out?
It really depends on what it is. So I can't give you a fair answer about that because we don't know at this point what it is that this osmosis filter may or may not be effective to remove. Sorry, but that's the best answer I can give you.
Hi, my name is Ken Osborne. I live on 85th Road North. I have for the past 21 years. Here in my hand, I have ground up construction debris that in the past 3 to 4 years has been deposited on people's properties that were low for fill. I want to know if this has been tested yet, or if any samples have been given to you, and is this a possible pathogen for, seepage or leaching into the groundwater? I do tractor work, and I've had several neighbors that have asked me to knock their piles of this material down. I refuse to put my tractor back on it now, from what I've found in it. This stuff is ground up construction debris that has come from a recycling place that is cheap, and it's a possible pathogen.
Let me answer your question to my understanding, best my understanding. I'm not aware of any sampling of fill soil that has been performed as of yet in the community. I'm aware that a soil sample was, or a number of soil samples were taken at a nearby 2 schools, I believe an elementary school and a middle school, and they were tested. I don't know if that material was the kind of pulverized construction and demolition fill you have identified as a potential problem. My kind of supposition was that it was not. I don't know that it was. So I can't tell you that of the few soil samples from the community of which I'm aware, was it kind of native soil or was it some kind of more recent pulverized C&D? I will say generally that contaminants in soil do migrate into groundwater when it rains if they are soluble in water, and most chemicals are. That's often and typically how contaminants come to be in the groundwater in the first instance. Chemicals are on the top of the ground or placed in landfills or lagoons within the ground. Rainfall percolates through those contaminants and leaches them into the underlying soil. So I think your concern with the potential for contaminated fill is unfortunately a real one.